Good morning. Welcome to the 20th lecture of the Logical Reasoning in Human Genetics series. Logical Reasoning in Human Genetics, or LRHG, is an initiative that we started with Institut Pasteur Tunis 3 years ago during COVID as a webinar series and a recorded series of lectures. And as you can see, it survived the pandemic. Each semester, we bring together scholars from the Global South and their peers from the Global North to discuss their latest research in the field of human genetics. In fact, this is our main mission at Columbia Global Centers, to be a bridge between different worlds. And as we're meeting now, a number of important events are taking place, linked to Columbia and reminding us of the importance of linkages. At this exact minute, the inauguration of Columbia University's 20th president is happening in New York. President Minouche Shafik was born in Africa to Egyptian parents, and she moved to the US when she was a child. Today, she becomes officially our president and the head of one of the most important centers of knowledge in the world. Today as well, the Nobel Chemistry Prize was awarded to 3 individuals. One of them is a Columbia professor, Luis Bruce, so congratulations to Columbia. And the other is an MIT scientist whose name is Tunisian and whose father is Tunisian, Monji Bawendi, which means that Columbia Global Centers Tunis is not only celebrating its 20th LRHG lecture, but also celebrating a new president and 2 Nobel Prizes. Congratulations again. So for this special session, this 20th session, we partnered with our sister center in East Africa, the Columbia Global Centers Nairobi, represented today by my colleague Pauline Muthoni, the programs manager. And thanks to CGC Nairobi, we have the honor of hosting Dr. Syokau Ilovi, internist and clinical geneticist at the Nairobi School of Medicine at the University of Nairobi in Kenya. Dr. Ilovi's areas of interest span academic and clinical medicine, research, and patient advocacy. Having recently undertaken training in clinical genetics, her current focus is on advancing genetics within the Kenyan population through clinical care, research, and policy formulation. She will talk about the cultural perspectives on autism spectrum disorder in Africa, a topic that is of high importance and that is often neglected in Africa and many places in the world, and that is getting more and more attention. The discussant today is Dr. Joseph Terwilliger, Professor of Neurobiology at Columbia University and a member of the LRHG Steering Committee and of the Faculty Advisory Committee of Columbia Global Centers Tunis. Dr. Terwilliger, Professor Terwilliger research is focused on development and application of computer software for statistical genetics applications and software for stimulating the evolution of phylogenetic relationships on a genome-wide scale. Now, Pauline, the floor is yours. And again, welcome everyone.
Thank you, Yusuf. Greetings, everyone. My name is Pauline Muthoni. I work at Columbia Global Centers, Nairobi, which is a sub-Saharan hub for Columbia University. We share a similar mandate with our sister CGC Tunis, as Yusuf has mentioned, where we foster and facilitate local collaborations in research, education, and public programming between our local partners and Columbia University community within our respective regions. We are very excited to partner with CGC Tunis on this particular LRHG lecture session on cultural perspectives on autism spectrum disorder in Africa, with Dr. Syokau Ilovi from University of Nairobi. We celebrate that this demonstrates not only cross-center collaborations, but also serves as a link between our regional institutions, which could also be a doorway to future partnerships. Please accept warm greetings from our director, Dr. Murugi Dirango. Thank you so much for having us. Dr. Lee, you're welcome to take it from here. Thank you.
So I'm wanted just again to welcome everyone back for our 3rd year of this workshop. We started, as most of you know, during COVID, when everybody was sitting at home with no chance of doing very much. I visited North Africa in 2020, right before COVID started, and then, well, we couldn't pursue our the research collaborations we'd planned at that time. So instead, we came up with the idea to do this sort of online workshop where we would invite speakers from the North and the South to come and talk, and then have a discussion about how our research in genetics, breaking it down to kind of like first principles thinking, so that people could, instead of learning a bunch of tools and recipes and techniques, which they teach in school, we focus more on the fun part of science, which is thinking, trying to come up with new ideas and thinking in different ways. And so, you know, we've been able to manage to continue this since 2021. In January, we started, and now we're already in 2023, looking forward to continuing this for another year. Of course, at the beginning, we had many people from all over the world watching live online. Nowadays, it's more people watch it when they go home and when they can, because people are back to work now and the world is back to normal. So we're glad about all of those things. But of course, what we're going to do here is have a nice talk. We're very happy to welcome Dr. Ilovi, and we're looking forward to hearing more about their research in Kenya. And we hope that over time, this will build into something where we can, you know, use the power of Zoom to bring us all together and try to, you know, come up with some new ideas. So let me just turn it over to you, and she'll give her talk, and at the end we'll have a nice big open discussion and try to think about what you know, what it means in terms of the logical reasoning underlying it. So please, I would like to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, CDC Tunis and Nairobi, and for having me. I really looking forward to this. Please allow me to share my slides. Let me know if it's
Yes, we can see. Thank you.
okay. Thank you so much for having me. So over the next 30 or 40 minutes, I want us to take a step back from the human genome and look at how cultural perspectives shape patient outcomes. And in our case study here will be on autism spectrum disorder. So this was my preliminary results that I did looking at cultural perspectives on autism in Africa between the year 2013 and 2023. So we know about human evolution. Initially, we were one race. Then the earliest divergence was between the Africans and non-Africans. So we are going to spend time looking at African cultural perspectives, which I want to spend time on. So who's an African? So Africa is made up of 54 countries, 1.4 billion people, and has about 2,000 living languages, the largest, which is the Bantu languages, the Niger-Congo languages, then the Afro-Asiatic languages, which are largely North Africa. So I want us to do a visual representation of between the two centers, Tunisia and Nairobi. If we were to walk from Tunisia to Nairobi today, an average of 6 hours a day, to take us a little over a year to make that distance. We know when the early Africans were migrating, they took about 500 years for the Bantu migration. So that by the time they were migrating from East Africa, which is the cradle of mankind, and they were spreading out into other regions of the world, and North Africa and South Africa and the like, that time period, the hundreds and millennia, thousands of years, led to cultural evolution in addition to genetic evolution. So what impact does this have? So that if you look at the two countries, Tunisia, their architecture is very different from traditional architecture in East Africa. The foods are different. They speak different languages. But are they that different? And how can we harness and interpret these differences? So my main objective for today is to look at how social determinants of health actually impact health outcomes. Initially, in earlier medicine, the focus was on biomedical factors, but increasingly people are looking at social factors and how they influence health outcomes. So that our biomedical factors here would be the genetics of autism, but then how our cultural and individual and cultural perspectives shaping health outcomes. So the hypothesis is, are Africans culturally similar or dissimilar? And how does this play out when you're looking at a disorder like autism spectrum disorder? So we carried out this review this year, and we looked at cultural studies that were carried out in Africa, and we identified 9 cultural studies that fit our preset criteria. But we also looked at to look at how little research in genetics and ASD is being undertaken in Africa, looking at clinicaltrials.gov. Out of the almost 1,000 registered interventional trials during the same period, only 13 were being conducted in Africa. So when we look at the cultural perspectives, we identified 9 studies covering North Africa and East Africa. So we'll go through them just to identify what people thought of neurodevelopmental disorders with a focus on autism. So this was a study that was published this year looking at Egypt, which looked at undergraduates, 300 undergraduates. So these are well-educated and well-exposed people, and they looked at their knowledge on autism spectrum disorder. It was moderate, so showing there's a lack of knowledge within the community on autism, and they possess largely neutral attitudes around people with autism spectrum disorder. Interestingly, people who had a contact with autism spectrum disorder people or had media exposure had a better positive attitude. So this would imply that if we increase media visibility of people of autism, the perspectives of people would improve positively. So another study, now we come lower down Egypt, now we are coming down the Nile, Ethiopia, looked at mothers with, of 20 mothers of children with autism. And interestingly, all of them reported that they did not receive adequate post-test counseling for their child's diagnosis. And when they were asked about the causes of what they thought the autism was, there was quite a bit of spirituality, like God's will, or poor obstetric care. And only 3 of the 20 participants actually identified potential genetic factors as a cause of ASD. So it's showing there's quite a bit of knowledge gap of mothers who already have a child who's been through the healthcare system, who's been diagnosed with autism. And that gaining acceptance of the diagnosis was associated with improved hope, and hopefully that translates to better outcomes for both the child and their families. So still in Ethiopia, children who appeared morphologically normal had delayed recognition. And there was quite a bit of encouragement by relatives and the community to seek traditional healers and spiritual healers. Quite a bit of stigma because both in the community and in school, because of poor understanding of symptoms, people fearing that if they interact with people with autism, the curses might extend to them. With those families with children with ASD are isolating from society. And of course, single mothers tend to bear the brunt because they are both the provider and healthcare giver, as well as the source of income for the family. Spirituality was associated with hope and movement from despair. So quite a bit of sense. So that is North Africa. It's not moving. So then when we come to my country, Kenya, this was now community. They went out into the community and asked for what people thought of ASD. There was one participant who had a family member with ASD, and the themes were still the same. They still have quite a bit of stigma about and acceptance of these people, so that despite the advances that have been made, people are still lacking awareness on the causes of ASD, and they felt that the government support could improve, could be improved so that the people can access care. So when we come to Morocco, closer to Tunisia, interestingly, this looked at children who are aged all the way from up to 20 years. And of those parents, 75% thought that autism is curable. So this is someone who's had a child who's 10 years old, and they are still have not been equipped, either because of inadequate access to healthcare, that they still believe that there is a cure and their child will go back to being developmentally normal. So there's quite a huge gap between family and community awareness, and perhaps how healthcare is interacting with these people to increase the knowledge, so that people spend more resources trying to manage their condition rather than seeking cure. And this tended to drive people to seek alternative therapy because they believe they get cured. And the disadvantage of that, what would happen, some families would complain because they are seeking dual therapy, traditional healers and conventional medicine. So they'd say that their finances were being depleted. So this one was another one, but it looked at healthcare workers, doctors, educators, and government officials. And the themes are still the same, that people shun people with developmental beliefs, believing their curses. Some of the curses that were attributed, that was a common theme both in North Africa and East Africa, is that neurodevelopmental disorders or congenital disorders as a group were largely attributed to parental infidelity. So that if a child is born with a neurodevelopmental or congenital disorder, it was felt that perhaps this was a way to punish the parents for having been unfaithful or having committed a transgression. And sometimes they believe that if they went and sought traditional or spiritual intervention, then this curse could be reversed. In Kenya, the themes were still the same, that children are not accessing formal education. And in some instances, because children who have physical disabilities have to access public schools using public transport, sometimes the special schools are far off. Sometimes they would have to be put into a boarding school so that they can access both education and institutionalized care, so that the boarding school for facility was not out of parents' wish, but was more for convenience to allow them to manage. And the theme that came out quite commonly in Kenya is that they felt beyond the school after children, because like even from my own experience, we have quite a bit of special education schools, but there is no government or policy of what happens once they exit the school system. So that there is no employment, inclusive education or employment engagement that occurs beyond the standard age of school, let's say 15 to 18 years old. So that after that, now they resort back to be within the home, yet they can be productive and they can find meaningful engagement and employment. The same theme, God's punishment, witchcraft, parental infidelity. This kept coming out, and this would lead, because now to become a blame game between communities, that now this is evidence that something went on in that family. Another study that looked at, this one was a study that looked at caregivers and seeking alternative and traditional healing is still the same theme, leading to financial constraints and disappointment that neither therapy yielded the desired results, which most of the time was improvement of symptoms, if not outright cure. So back to East Africa, Ethiopia, supernatural causes, God's punishment. So it was the recurrent theme, with 54% having sought help the first time from traditional healers. Traditional and biomedical treatments were used in 27% of the people, prayer, animal sacrifices, and incense. So that most families, out of one, lack of knowledge, but also desperation and trying to hold on to hope, would mix all forms of therapy. So that when we look at the last one, the themes is the same. So that from North Africa, East Africa, the themes are the same: inadequate knowledge on the biomedical causation of autism and other neurodevelopmental disorders, and its prognosis, how it can be managed, and also now the cultural aspects. So that when we look at overall, despite us having evolved from a shared ancestry thousands of years back, Africans have maintained the same cultural beliefs. They are highly spiritual. They believe in faith healing, curses, and often mixing of conventional and traditional healing. One of the major differences between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa is consanguinity. Consanguinity is practiced in North Africa, and it's accepted, and it's forthcoming. But in East Africa, consanguinity is even shunned upon. Like in Kenya, it's actually in the law that it's illegal for anyone who's non-Muslim. So that if you're taking a genetic history, it might not be very forthcoming from patients because it's something that is not culturally acceptable. So that we might be missing some cases of consanguinity and possible recessive traits pulling within a family due to consanguinity because of the nature of the. So that when you're looking at the North African studies, they consistently ask for consanguinity. None of the others sub-Saharan studies looked at consanguinity. There's another arm that I'm not presenting today. We also looked at the phenotypic. So we have a total of about 30 studies. None of the sub-Saharan studies asked for consanguinity in the collection, so that we might be missing out on this important aspect in genetic disease causation. So what are the possible delays of these unique cultural perspectives that may be unique to the African setting, so that even interventions that are being planned in this part of the world need to incorporate that there's still quite a bit of delay in seeking conventional treatment, stigma, both within the family and the community, increased cost of seeking both conventional and traditional treatment. I'm not sure about the experience in North Africa, but in Kenya, for example, most of these treatments are sought out of pocket. So the system is two-way. So there's the public health insurance, which covers for minimal interventions, and there's privately sourced insurance, which excludes genetic disorders. So that in Kenya, you can actually, we don't have laws that protect against discrimination for people with genetic disorders. And then, of course, if people are using the conventional therapies and herbal medications, there's a potential for toxic drug interactions between the two. And often when patients come to the conventional medical practice, they withhold the other information because they know it's discouraged. So that information might not be forthcoming. And for me, I think that the last bullet is the one that is most concerning, that people, parents with children with autism have a high expectation that the autism is curable. And perhaps that is leading them to seek unconventional treatment that is costly and potentially dangerous in the hope of attaining a cure for their child so that their child can grow up like others. So how can we, there are positive cultural perspectives. Africans are very community-centered. And that sense of community, if we can have strategies that educate the community on acceptance and management of this. It will help both the individual family cope better and acceptance of people within the society with reduced stigma, so that interventions that are targeting communities are likely to be highly impactful. And perhaps when doing genetic studies, including ethnographic evaluations for better outcomes, because it's practiced routinely by patients so that they are seeking dual therapy. But if it's not asked for, it's not going to be very forthcoming in the either clinic setup or research setup, so that is the missing link that might explain some of the outcomes that are being observed. And that is the end. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for your talk. It's very interesting. So, I don't know. Should we? Is everyone coming back? You can all come back in now. So you were talking a lot about how people perceive autism in Africa. Is there in sub-Saharan Africa? Is there also a difference in the appearance of the disease, given that it's a much more, people seem much more outgoing, you said more community driven, so it's a more social sort of society, right? And autism has to do with difficulties in socializing, right? So it might be more noticeable perhaps than in a place like Finland, where they joke that after COVID, instead of standing 2 meters apart, they go back to the usual 20 meters apart. So you might not notice it. So how does that affect this thing?
That's a very, very good question. So one of the themes that came out when they were looking at cultural adaptation of ASD tools, they found them not to be cultural appropriate. So one of the things, lack of eye contact is considered one of the cardinal symptoms of autism. But in some African cultures, it's actually discouraged for children to make eye contact. Mm-hmm. So that a child who's not making eye contact might be missed because they are being considered respectful. Mm-hmm. So some of those cultural nuances might make a diagnosis of autism less, but it would also increase because they were finding one of the biggest predictors for diagnosing autism in Africa was mm-hmm. having an older sibling and children who had frequent contacts with their grandmothers. They singled out grandmothers because a grandmother has been exposed to many children. So that the community setup where they are exposed to extended families would tend to lead to increased noticing of the symptoms. So that if it was a first-time mom or a first-time dad, the community would be more likely to help pick out the symptoms and ask for treatment. Now, the interesting thing is that when that was identified within the community, the most likely treatment sought would be traditional. We have found this. We think it's because of some either cause or disagreement. So the goal for that would not be to go see the medical doctor. Perhaps you go for some spiritual therapy. So that the social deficits would be picked, but the route to care might be a bit protracted because they pass somewhere else. And then they come to hospital and they are told there is no cure. They'd rather go this other place where there is hope for cure.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, it raises another question, of course, as geneticists. We decide whether or not something's genetic based on co-occurrence in families. And you're saying when you have larger families, you're more likely to detect it. So that would sort of make it look more genetic than it is, perhaps? I mean, that sounds like an ascertainment problem as well, right? If you're mostly getting it because they're in a family.
Sorry, I didn't quite get your question.
Okay, so like when we're studying, various traits in families,
yes,
we look at whether they occur more frequently in families than they do by chance in the population. That's the evidence. It's genetic.
Yes.
But when you have a situation where the fact that they're in a large family with other kids, that would increase the likelihood of being detected, which might
Yes.
make it look more familial than it is and increase the evidence that it was genetic.
Yes. So let me draw my experience with another childhood genetic disorder that's highly clustering in families that we found that it also causes some neurodevelopmental, and the children were dying. So there's one family I took care of where in the extended family, they lost about 4 children under the age of 4. So that is a cursed family. People don't want to associate them. People don't want to marry them. So that once that connection is made, that link is made, it's considered a curse, and the management of curses stay away as far as possible. But if people knew it's genetic, that these people did not do anything wrong, perhaps more acceptance would be possible.
So are there any ongoing studies of autism in Kenya that are looking at molecular genetics, or is it mostly still trying to identify families and try to work with them for getting them to seek help?
There's a paper that came out this year that looked at, I think they did the first year, they were looking at whole exome sequencing, and they compared South Africa to North Africa. Those were the preliminary results. They have not shared. They found pathogenic and likely pathogenic, but the data sets, they are still working on it, but that is ongoing work. So that's the reason I picked this, because even the work I was doing, I also looked at what the genomic data looked like. I found the cultural perspective very interesting, so that even in my care as a physician, sometimes drawing from the patient's cultural perspective, there are certain things I might miss if I don't focus on it.
How about like just basic idea? Do you have an idea of the prevalence in Kenya of autism?
So when you look at the autism, the phenotypic is the same. It's commoner in boys. On all the 34 studies I looked at, there is no single study that found it either equal or less in boys. The same 3-to-1, 4-to-1. The syndromic cases, when they looked for them, they would find them. Chromosomal would be Down syndrome. So it seems to be the same. Of course, when you look at North Africa, you find your phenylketonuria and the like, the clustering of recessive traits, phenylketonuria and the like. But the phenotype is no different. It's the same disease. Yes.
But I mean, like, it seems that you have some problems, you said, because people don't report it. So you don't know how many people in the country, for example, had what percentage. Because if there's difficulties with diagnosis and they don't seek treatment, it must be difficult to know how common it is overall.
Yes. And what happens, the healthcare system here is largely out of pocket. So if you have a child who's neurodevelopmentally different, if they don't have particularly bothersome symptoms, they may not actually go to hospital. So that what will bring them is like epilepsy, things that are dramatic. But if they're just having some difficulty in speech, and they might not seek treatment, because that one, they know not much will happen. So yes, it's definitely underreported and under-investigated.
Well, Joe has kind of expertise more than I do in this area, so I guess I should let Joe. I think he wanted to jump in there, right?
Well, let me, rather than jumping into my neuro expertise, can I ask you a very fundamental question? I mean, I've been to Kenya for a week, so I'm no expert in Kenya. So I'm not even gonna pretend to know something about Kenya. But let me ask you, Kenya is a big country, correct?
Yes.
So meaning that there should be a large population. And
40-50 million.
Given that it will take almost a year to walk from Tunisia to Kenya, the people are separated so that there should be a multiple ethnic groups within Kenya,
Yes.
and then they're quite different. And then you mentioned earlier that there is stigma against autism spectrum disorder or any other various neuropsychological diseases of some sort. And then the level of stigma is going to differ by ethnicity depending on their culture. So how would you go about studying something as complicated as affective to ASD in such a broad population with a wide complications, large amount of variation across different populations? Do you have sort of like a grand scheme? If you had a multi-million-dollar in your pocket, how would you go about doing it?
That's a very, very good question, because I don't, in my opinion, the intervention here needs to be culturally sensitive and people-centered to be able to change some of those perspectives. But even when you look at the different groups, linguistically, we might look that different, but they seem to share commonalities. That culturally, they are, I mean, I was quite surprised between myself and Moroccans. We believe pretty much the same. The people have the same beliefs. So that culturally, it seems to be one basket with maybe small differences, but it's achievable because if you're looking at one essentially culturally homogeneous group, perhaps the genotypes would be different depending on the groups.
But that's kind of important in genetics, I guess, right? If there's a lot of significant genetic variation within the country, because that, I mean, we're always told how Africa is the most genetically diverse place on Earth. So there must be, you know, some interesting differences between these different populations. For us, that's what's really interesting, because we focus on, Joe and I both work in populations around the world that are isolated and different genetically more than culturally, because then you find unique genetic factors. So I mean, that's, I think, what he was trying to ask about is there a big difference there? And also, if there are different languages, doesn't it require then a different team of people to work with each of these subpopulations?
Okay, so that when it comes to languages, so we have different ethnic languages, but the national languages are two, Kiswahili and English. By and large, most people speak at least Kiswahili and English because they've been to school. And so that in terms of language barriers for research, perhaps not so much. And but the genetic differences, there must be there, so that at the end of the day, looking at one corner of Kenya will not answer for another section. And that will be interesting to see what comes up.
I mean, the other thing you said that really excites people like me and Joe is when you talked about how large the families are and how grandmothers have seen so many kids. And for genetics, that is the gold mine, because in Europe and in North America, people have one child, maybe two, but they don't ever have really big families. So it's hard for us to do actual studies to find genes that affect these different traits. So it sounds like that the biggest advantage that you guys have in genetics, if what you say is true, is this very large extended pedigree. So how what's the average number of kids per mother or per grandmother? I mean, how big are these families that you're talking about?
Okay, so it depends on level of education. So that if you find for people who've been beyond high school, who've exited before high school, the number tends to be higher. When you move to 1 degree, it starts approaching European 2, 3, so that of people who have 1 or 2 university degrees, they don't go beyond 3 children, majority. But now when you go to the rural setting where people sometimes exit school in primary level, 3, 4, 5. This is now the last 2 generations.
Mhm.
If you go back 2 generations, it would average 5. If you go back 3, it would average 6, 7. So that you have people in their 60s, 70s who have 6 or 8 siblings.
Mhm.
And interestingly, when I'm drawing a pedigree, when I have my patient, they usually say, okay, I'll go and ask, there's an auntie or there's a grandmother who will give me all the information that I need. So they tend to be the source of the family knowledge.
Sure, everywhere it's like that. Yeah. But I mean,
Yes.
that just sounds like, that seems to me to be your biggest advantage in genetics, is this. That's still huge families by our standards. So there's so much more you can ask there. Yusuf, you have your hand raised?
Yeah, thank you. And by the way, people attending, you can ask your questions in the Q&A. I had a question on the data itself. So did you look, I'm not sure I
Yes.
heard that during your presentation. Did you look at, for instance, only the African population or also the Indian population in Kenya? Are there differences there between these 2 communities when it comes to autism?
So my data was limited to people living in Africa. When I went to the individual studies, so that they had to be residents of Africa. But if you come to a country like Kenya.
No, sorry, I meant the Indian population in Kenya and East Africa.
Okay, so when I went to the individual studies, they didn't do a special mention on people's ethnicity or race. In fact, it's only of the sub-Saharan, it's only a couple of South African studies where they would say white South Africans and black. But the rest of Africa, they would just say, so that it wasn't very clear on if they had sampled some of those. But you can infer that when you look at studies done at the coast of Kenya. Coast tends to have a bit of Arabic influence both in culture and religion. They tend to be Muslims. They tend to have had quite a bit of Arabic influence. But the themes were the same. So that across Kenya, from east to west, from Indian Ocean inwards, the beliefs were not that different. But to answer your question directly, no, they didn't segregate perhaps Asian or Arabic people in Kenya. That wasn't specifically mentioned.
Joe, you were trying to say something before when I accidentally interrupted you. Not accidentally, but I interrupted you.
I'm just curious. In Kenya, is there prenatal screening of some sort, so that when mother gets pregnant, that you have some ideas as to what proportion of the newborn will have a Down syndrome or any other neurological developmental problems, early stage? That would be something useful to have, because in the United States, 60 years ago, the life expectancy used to be under 10 years of age. Now it's approaching over 60. So, because in the United States, most children with Down syndrome have some sort of a congenital heart defects, which are now corrected by surgery. And so if you have some idea as to what is happening in Kenya, that you can actually figure out what is the natural history of the disease better than what you would expect to see in the United States. So there are research questions that you can ask in Kenya that is not answerable in the United States. So I think the point I'm making is that some of the questions can only be answered better in Kenya than in the States or Europe. And I think these are the sort of questions that you can ask. How can you look at your population to understand the biological natural history of the disease process better? So I think that's something that it may be worth thinking about from the local scientist perspective.
Thank you very much for that question and for that insight. To answer your initial question, we don't routinely do prenatal or newborn screening for genetic disorders.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yes. So usually about 50% of the people with 50% of the fetus that have some sort of anomalies are aborted spontaneously.
Mm.
So whatever you see at birth is a very small proportion of kind of congenital problems that a child may have. And then, Down syndrome is, when you talk about autism, and I think Down syndrome has a completely different path through which these phenotypic expression gets studied, but it'd be very interesting to look at. But I think it would be nice if there is some national effort to see what the prevalence of these diseases are, which probably would be difficult to do unless there is a government assessment of some sort. Is there such a effort to see what national health survey or some
at a national level?
Yeah.
No.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, so you said that a lot of people seek out these traditional healing things. You mentioned animal sacrifice was one of the techniques they used to deal with it. They keep doing it. Is there any placebo effect or anything that this stuff actually has a positive effect on the outcomes at all?
Okay. So let me draw on my other clinical background. So I've found from my clinical experience, people tend to go to alternative medicine when they have lost hope in conventional therapies. So like ARVs, I've never had a patient tell me they have gone to a traditional healer for HIV. Why? Because everybody knows ARVs work. But we see it a lot in cancer, and we see it a lot in genetic disorders, neurodevelopmental, because they come and they're told there is no cure or palliation for chemo. So they are sort of trying to grasp and bargain for some hope. In the hope, and see if they don't understand exactly what the underlying, it's just trying to hold on to some hope. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's not that different anywhere else in the world, because with autism, nobody has any real idea, right, of either the cause or what to do about it, right? So that's why it's such a mysterious problem for us.
And it's very distressing to the family.
Of course.
So I mean, they're doing the best they can. What do they have to lose?
Yeah. I know, of course. I mean, people here do the same things. They try all these alternative therapies and things. And why not, right? If real medicine doesn't lead anywhere, why not try something else?
Why not try? They have nothing to lose.
So go ahead.
No, after you.
So you mentioned earlier that there's an African genomic study that is ongoing. What sort of how are you approaching African genomic study, and then what phenotypes are you looking at?
So that work is actually a paper I came across. I'm not involved in it.
I mean, researcher.
But when I did my research
in Kenya,
it was the only one that looked at whole. It was the only study I came across that has employed whole exome sequencing to try and define the causation of neurodevelopmental disorders. The others were small studies where somebody would pick one gene, or would look for Phenylketonuria, would do a karyotype. So, and that was a recent one. It was published July this year. So that now there is an increased effort to try and better define the genotype of people with a phenotypic representation of a disorder.
Yeah, if it seems like if somebody's doing sequencing on these individuals, it would make sense to get as many phenotypes as possible so that you get bigger bang for the buck.
I think they were doing 5,000. I'll share it on the, or I'll share it when I'll get the link. But they're doing quite a bit of work. Over 5,000. They're pretty heavy. Very well.
Right,
I'll source it
5,000
and
people
share.
are being exome sequenced.
Yes, I'll look for the paper and share. It's pretty
And
impressive
is it
work.
spread evenly across the country, or is it focusing on Nairobi, or?
They looked at 2 sites, South Africa and Kenya. I'll look for it and share. But there's renewed interest in that field in this part of the world.
So like with autism, is there evidence of like Asperger's in the parents or in any of these communities, or is it just looking at the most serious autism in the children?
It's more of the latter, that if someone brings a child who has a problem, that will be the focus. Unless
is there any evidence of, because Asperger is presumably more common than autism and it tends to be in similar families?
Yes, but if people are seeking care out of pocket, someone who seems to be okay-ish might not make it to hospital. That's the one. That's even what I was saying. In one paper, they found the dramatic symptoms, so that you can find a child who's 10 years, who's never gone to actually seek definitive diagnosis. So they're just being managed. They're doing well. They're being taken care of at home because the costs are prohibitive and the like.
Now, this is a little bit off topic, but I have a question because, we often have talked about some of the things that are noticed about certain genetic diseases in sub-Saharan Africa. And one of them is that seems to be missing there is Phenylketonuria, right? Which is like one of the most common genetic diseases in Europe. And nobody seems to understand why it doesn't seem to be seen in Africa. And I was just wondering if you had any thought about that or some of these other things like that just seem very strange given how much genetic diversity you have in Africa. And that one, is it just a question of there's not good, very, very detailed screening or things like that? Or do you think there might be some real differences there?
For phenylketonuria, so when they were looking at causative genes for the autism, phenylketonuria of the 34 studies, they only looked for it north of the Sahara. So that if it exists in East Africa, it hasn't been looked for. So sometimes it's a question of people don't think it's there, so it's not being looked at, but it's not evidence that it's not there.
Right.
So that PKU was almost exclusively being looked at in North Africa.
Right, in Europe, yeah. But it's so common. It's such a big gene that it's hard to believe there aren't, mutations in sub-Saharan Africa, given the diversity. That's why I was curious.
Yes, they would need to be looked for. So we can't conclusively say they are missing because they have not been documented. It was very interesting. So you could see at the Sahara, there'd be a distinction. What they are looking for, PKU, consanguinity. It's like consanguinity. I can't conclusively tell you it's missing in East Africa or my country, Kenya, because it's not asked for. And sometimes in knowing my cultural background, it might not even be forthcoming. Yeah. So it's a question of someone going to look and determining whether PKU is there or not.
Yeah, because I guess the symptoms come quite late, right? Rather relatively later in life, so they might just not notice, right? If there is a lot of a problem. It's interesting. So we're always just trying to figure out what is different and what could be interesting to look at given these differences and everything. So it's really fascinating to hear all of your perspectives, because obviously we as biologists tend to try to reduce everything to DNA equals, traits. But of course, the cultural aspect and the environmental aspects are often even larger, right, than the genetic ones, even for something like autism, because even in families, it's not that clearly genetic. So it's really interesting, and it'll be really important to look at this in more detail when you can have more, when Joe Lee gives you that multi-million dollars to let you go do the study across Kenya.
And even when they're looking at possible etiologies of autism like vitamin D, it would be good to tell the prevalence in a place in Joseph's desert in Tunisia, vis-a-vis some highland in Ethiopia that almost never gets direct sunlight, to see whether so it would be good to look at these environmental factors and how they differ from one region to the other.
No, absolutely. Joe, do you have any more questions? Because I mean, Joe works with Down syndrome and Alzheimer and all these neurological disorders, so I figured he may have something to say.
I already mentioned that I think Down syndrome is so. I study Down syndrome specifically because they have 3 chromosome on 21, which contains the gene that makes the protein that causes Alzheimer's disease. So they're, if you will, a very nice human model system of knock-in for dementia. So I think as such, I am sure that there are such situations where you can look at Kenyan population and then you may be able to find a unique population that is worth following through. And then the best way to follow through is by looking at family structure to see whether certain things are clustering. And then if they're clustering, then it's worthwhile looking at. And then I think those are far more efficient way to look at genetic effect than just randomly selecting samples across population, because these disease or variants are very rare, so that the probability of you finding something interesting physiologically would be very low. So I think if you have, the local disease prevalence far better than we do, so you can sort of think about what kind of disease that is unique to Kenyan population that is not common in outside world. And then I think that's something to do. And I think probably pediatric disease would be a good thing for you guys to look at, because I assume the life expectancy is going to be in 60s, so that dementia is not going to be a major thing to study. It's going to be of less interest, I think. Pediatric disease such as autism and these are going to be far more relevant for your medical and public health needs. So I think but at any rate, I think it would be cool if you continue to have this conversation with Tunisian and then Nairobi, Columbia Global Center, and then, maybe as we continue to have conversation, we may come across ideas to collaborate on research projects and so forth. So I think that's the way to go.
Yeah, we're jealous of your large families. It's the greatest thing in the world for genetics, and we just don't have them.
They come in handy even for community support.
No, absolutely. I mean, it gives you so many opportunities to do genetic research that we don't have. And what I always try to emphasize is, like, when you're in these places like in sub-Saharan Africa or North Africa as well, where they have big families with consanguinity and you have big families without consanguinity, those are two interesting things to compare with each other. And neither one of them can be done very efficiently in the US, China, or Europe, because we don't have those. So I really always emphasize, try to find what you have that's different and really try to find a way to use that, to answer some good questions. And I think that that's ultimately what we've been trying to cover in this course, just what makes you guys different, what makes it more interesting, what makes Jolie jealous, which is the fact that you have big families and he doesn't, and how you can use all this to answer some really cool questions. So, I mean, unless there are some additional questions, I guess it's 11 o'clock. So we'd really like to thank you so much for your participation. And we hope that we can expand more and do some more things together with people in Kenya or other parts of sub-Saharan Africa jointly with us, because I think by working together, we can do so much more interesting science. So I really appreciate you taking time to do this. And thank you so much. Joe, do you have anything to add?
No, you said it all. Thank you. It was very nice talking to you, and hopefully we'll continue to have conversations.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Youssef, would you like to say anything in closing?
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Ilovi. And as Joe was saying, we will be very happy to continue this discussion on behalf of the two global centers, the two African global centers of Nairobi and Tunis. We're very happy to have you with us today, Dr. Ilovi, and hopefully